Hello, everyone. Welcome to the YouTube version of the Ministry and Secular Age podcast. I'm Andrew Root with my co-host, producer Derek Tronsgard. If you want the more highly produced version of this podcast, you can get that where you get your podcast that Derek puts together. But this is a kind of raw, a little bit longer version that is video, whether that's good or bad. Um, I have a little wind effect going here because it's like 120 degrees in the Twin Cities, believe it or not.
It
So
is about as hot as I can ever remember it being here. It's been gnarly,
it's
but
crazy.
uh, but we're in luck because we have some hot theological discussion that's going to happen in here today. That was terrible. We're going to cut that out anyway. uh, Andy, you sent me a text that was a screenshot of a book, and there is big pink highlights, and it looks like it's scribbled frantically over this paragraph. There's like stars, exclamation points, brackets, and I'm just picturing you late at night being in your office and, just getting all excited about this paragraph. And then in big bold letters next to it, you wrote, "This is," underlined is, "the issue," exclamation point. And you texted this to me. This is from Jim Loder, who was a famous theologian from Princeton Theological Seminary. And you said right before we started recording that he unfortunately passed away right before you enrolled there as a student. So you never got to have him as a teacher, but I know he's been influential for a lot of folks. And so what I want to do, Andy, is I just want to read this paragraph or sum it up and have you respond to it and explain to us why this is the underlined issue. So Jim Loder writes this. Basically, he says there's something called, or something that he will call, a convictional neurosis that pervades many mainline churches throughout the Western world. Individuals who have powerful religious experiences may not allow the insight that comes from these experiences to be known because they have not found receptivity on the part of the church or their religious peers. These experiences often represent embarrassing moments when the person themselves were not in control of their life, and so therefore they repress these experiences and they live off them inwardly, but outwardly say nothing, practicing the socially acceptable rituals of the church, perhaps with greater investment of energy than otherwise. The richness, vitality, and theological potential of these experiences are lost to the Christian community because the church does not know how to respond to them, given the theological limitations of the Christian enculturation of the ego. Convictional neuroses represents a socio-cultural imprisonment of the spiritual life. Andy, why is this the issue?
All right. So first thing to say is this is a quote that comes from Logic of the Spirit. So if people have not read The Logic of the Spirit by Jim Loder, it's totally worth reading. And I don't know, Derek, maybe we can do this on the podcast, but a retired pastor named Rick, I was at an event with him, and it was this like this West Coast pastors event, and it's been going on since, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s. And so they had listed every name that had given the lectures there, and I had the privilege of giving them in, I guess that, yeah, this year, so 2016, or 2016. We'll have to edit that out. 2026. What year is this? Yeah, I had the privilege of giving them in 26. And Jim Loder gave them in, like, I don't know, it was like maybe the late 70s or something like that. But anyhow, this guy had been going to every one of these. Like he's been to every one of these pastors' conferences back to the late 60s, early 70s. And he had all the tapes of these things. So he's like, I have Jim Loder's lectures from that thing. So he found them and he sent me the tapes of them and put them even on an MP3. So I'm gonna have to listen to them, and maybe we can even on this podcast like discuss these lectures that I don't know that have ever really other than those who heard those things 50 years ago, 40 years ago, has known them. But Loder is one of these brilliant minds that probably doesn't get read enough and has kind of been lost in I don't know, maybe in the last few decades, his genius has been lost. But he's just a fascinating person. But I think this quote that he lays out here is a really fascinating one because he does want to talk about the Spirit, and he is into the kind of Holy Spirit in many ways and kind of reflecting on the Spirit, but really particularly thinking about how the human spirit and the Holy Spirit find connection, and does really draw from a lot of psychological categories and things like that to kind of honor the psychological traditions for sure, but then also push back and think that they become myopically focused on just the self and forget that there's this dynamic of what it means to have this kind of sense of spirit, and that even what drives us, this book, The Logic of the Spirit, is really about a certain take on developmental theory, on what it means to grow up. And he puts it in a kind of vein of existential thought with Kierkegaard, and then also kind of puts it in this kind of driving theological force, the Spirit. And he thinks what it means to really grow up is to have a life in time that pushes you along. And as you are living that life of time, the human spirit yearns for, well, what he calls these questions of spirit. What is a lifetime and why do I live it? So really what propels us through our lives, and we could call this growing up or whatever, but from birth to death, we're always wrestling with these questions of spirit. What is a lifetime and why do I live it? And he doesn't think that there's any point from being an infant to being an elderly person who has maybe, found themselves sliding in dementia in some ways, that you never lose this driving reality of the human spirit to find answers to those questions. What is a lifetime and why do I live it? So there's a kind of fundamental spiritual reality. I mean, spiritual is a really muddy phrase for us moderns, because we think of like these wooey experiences of, walking on the beach or whatever. But he really means this kind of drive that he's really mining the sources of Kierkegaard. In this podcast, we mine the sources of Heidegger or something like that. But this kind of drive of what it means to have one's being in time, to have a kind of sense of one's being. But I think what's fascinating about this quote is something that I tried to kind of pull out in The Pastor in a Secular Age, is that I think there's a lot of people within our mainline congregations who have these experiences of spirit, or feel this sense of the human spirit moving them forward, or being encountered by the Holy Spirit in some way, being encountered by the Holy Spirit delivering the significance of Jesus' own lifetime to their lifetime, and calling them into that. And so they're having these experiences of transcendence, as we've called them, kind of through Charles Taylor. And yet there's something, I don't know, socialized into us mainliners that we don't want to talk about it. And I think particularly our pastors, I mean, I think this could be an overstatement, but I think broadly our pastors feel more uncomfortable with these kind of experiences that Loder is talking about than most people within our congregations. Like, I think people in our congregations, what does he call these? Convictional, what did he call them? He called them like convictional, you've lost.
Convictional neuroses.
Convictional neuroses. Like, people have these experiences, but we also are, because we're these kind of these creatures who are spiritually bound within time. We need kind of collectives and communities to tell these stories, and we can get this convictional neuroses as we enter into, even ironically, I think this is one of the major realities of living in a modern world, is that even our religious communities don't perpetuate the storytelling of these kind of experiences. And I do think, he says that right off the bat, that this happens within mainline churches. And he's writing this book in the early 1990s, that in mainline churches, if you have a experience of feeling your human spirit taken up into or encountered by the divine spirit in some way, you don't get much help narrating that experience. And you may even get looked at sideways by your pastor. And so I guess this is, what I've been trying to do in the larger Ministry in a Secular Age series, especially with The Pastor in a Secular Age, but beyond that, is how in some ways the immanent frame falls in on the head of the pastor more than anyone else. Like, the pastor feels very uncomfortable because of the dynamics of late modernity and the immanent frame, of being able to help people have these experiences of of spirit. I mean, at one level, just a human spirit that yearns for meaning and purpose. But when that gets taken up and encountered by something that feels outside, that feels like maybe the Holy Spirit or a God who speaks and moves and arrives, there's a certain perpetuation we have even within our churches to impose this kind of convictional neuroses, to not talk about that, to not think about that. And I do think our churches are really filled with people who have these kind of encounters, that have these kind of experiences. And I think, this is one of the reasons why I continue to focus on young people, is have a lot of those experiences in childhood, feel the nearness of God, or feel this overwhelming of being of beauty, or feel spoken to, or had a weird dream that felt so dynamic, or heard a sermon or something, or a Sunday school lesson, and broke down and cried and felt the Holy Spirit grab hold of them and make a claim on their lives. And yet they don't find a lot of space within our congregations to share that. So there's these certain pressures that are on us, I think, to perpetuate this, and to kind of, ironically close down the imminent frame even in our congregations. So, here's Loder, and I think this book came out in 96 or something like that. So probably writing this in the early 1990s, after the Twins won the World Series, with your Twins hat on right now. And here he is making these claims. And I think in some ways, I don't know if you would agree with this, Derek, but in some ways, I think it's even worse now. The convictional neuroses is almost has also become almost more acute in this moment.
As you were talking, it struck me really interesting. As I reflect on my own ministry, I think the place where I've seen people articulate experiences and divine encounters the most have been on youth trips, like specifically mission trips. And I wonder if it's partly age, where maybe adolescents, or, to your point, kids just don't have those same filters and fears of inadequacy that adults do, and they want to be more, curated and stuff. Also, I wonder if you're just in this intense environment where you're with the same people. You don't have the distractions of home. You probably don't have your phone. You're having group night every night where you're talking and, sort of as a little community working through these stories together. I think that's really interesting that, for me anyway, in the church, youth ministry has been the place where I've encountered this the most. And your sort of normal, quote unquote, adult ministry, which is like Sunday morning worship and maybe a Bible study here and there, it's few and far between. And I think there's something really telling about that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there is that kind of dynamic that plays out. I think especially with younger children, like I think youth mission trips and things like that. I think there's dynamics that lead this to come out. But I've also found, I don't know if you think this is true, but sometimes like older people, and like kind of more elderly people, will sidle up next to me and like have a story to tell. Or when I go to these congregations, and especially the lay people, do presentations around ministry in the secular age and talk about the imminent frame, or tell a story of a great encounter in the midst of suffering or loss, and this kind of tangible sense of the presence of God, people come forward, and it is often, maybe it's more elderly people because they just feel like they can come up and interrupt you and tell you a story or something. But there is a kind of certain interesting dynamic where I think with young people, it's something about actually experiencing the reality, more than kind of remembering. It's about having the experience. So maybe it's VBS, maybe not very often VBS, but for sure, like you're saying, youth mission trips or camp or whatever, like it is really having this encounter. But I think there's something about the unfolding of our lives, our lives in time, that if those experiences have been really formative in some way, though not really integrated in a kind of narrative sense, that there becomes certain other points in our lives where we really have to think about, like, did that happen or did that not happen? This is what I think he means by the convictional neuroses. Like, there's a certain kind of current to just forget about them, but there's certain things that happen in a church that lead people to remember. And in some sense, like, that's what we're supposed to be doing in preaching and taking the sacraments, is remembering. Like, remembering this experience is in some ways casting off the demon, if you will, of convictional neuroses and remembering again. Jesus tells us in the sacramental reality that he will be present as we remember in this meal his life, death, and resurrection. And yet that remembering, I don't know, I just find it really fascinating with mainline people that in some sense they will use two different ways to kind of, I don't know, maybe bolster their neuroses. Is one is a kind of, I mean, a drive towards a kind of political consciousness. It's like, well, what good does any kind of spiritual experience do if we just have to act in this way? Or else there's a kind of intellectualizing. You know what I mean? It's like, well, why I really like a mainline church is because we think heavily about the Bible, or we really reflect upon the tradition in certain ways, or we talk about these we talk about theology in some sense, and they tend not to mean like dogmatic theology, but they don't think about the rapture or something, or when they talk about or even read the book of Revelation, they read it in a kind of intellectualized kind of way. And both of those kind of
You won't
senses,
find the Left Behind books in our church library, right? Yeah.
yeah, like stuff like that, right? There's a kind of over and againstness to a certain kind of popular conservative Protestant culturalism, that plays itself out. But if we're not careful, like those two things are great, actually. I mean, I think a kind of sense of the gospel calling into actual direct action that has political purchase, at least, and even the kind of intellectualizing or the intellectual pursuits within our congregations are beautiful, are wonderful. But I do think the pastor has to wrestle with, do those also, especially within American mainline traditions, do those also produce convictional neuroses? Like, do they actually kind of work against this kind of direct reflection on the presence of Jesus Christ? And I think what Loder's trying to get at is like the whole Christian faith is contingent on the reality. I mean, it is built, it's hard baked into the reality that these women and these women before these men, but these women and these men have an experience of the resurrected Jesus Christ. Like they have this convictional experience that Jesus Christ is alive and speaks, and most directly, as we've talked about on this podcast, has encountered them as an event in time, in history, and called them and transformed them in a certain way. And I guess the question just becomes for us, if there is this sense of kind of like Christopraxis, Jesus Christ still acts and moves, Jesus Christ still encounters people and calls them to follow, a la Bonhoeffer, what do we do with that? How do we pivot away from or protect from what Loder's talking about here, so that we might have these spaces to do this kind of theological discernment, to do this kind of hermeneutical task of trying to interpret how God has encountered us, how Jesus Christ has been present within that, and how do we kind of protect without falling into anti-intellectualism or falling into a kind of Gnostic otherworldliness. How do we keep the other sides of those to perpetuating this kind of convictional neuroses? And so then you have all these people. I mean, this is what I'm experiencing as I talk about this stuff in churches, is I have all these people come up to me and be like, I've never told anyone this, but I had a miscarriage and an angel was right next to me in the midst of that. And I've never told anyone this in this church, but I can't, I can't escape this. What do I do with this? And it's just fascinating to me that there are all sorts of these stories just scattered around like buckshot all over our congregations. And yet people kind of pick up the vibe that they probably shouldn't talk about them, that it's going to take some special weird speaker to come in to even remind them that they had this experience as this person tells the story. You know what I mean? Like, they somehow don't become the continued fodder for our life together, nor the essential pieces, to go back to young people, like the essential pieces that we pass on faith to young people. I mean, it'll be interesting to say that one of the reasons, we do confirmation is because we believe in this tradition, because we read the Small Catechism, because we're Lutheran, but we're also a congregation of faith in that Lutheran disposition, say, I'm thinking of your church, Derek, that also has dozens of people, if not more, who have had these experiences with the resurrected Christ, and we're handing this on to you. We're asking if you can confirm this, and by confirm, I don't even mean like you hold it to be rationally, hermetically sealed, provable, but like, does something beckon you in those stories? Does something hold on to you? Like, you're not sure if 75-year-old Marilyn had it right, but you know that she is the kind of person who would testify to something real. And even if you're not sure you completely buy the experience she has. Do you think something encountered her? And that's worth you confirming and following. It's worth you trying to step on this path and do that. And I don't know. I mean, I just think Loder's insight here is I guess almost 30 years after him saying it. Well, exactly 30 years after him saying it, has been proven more true than ever.
The other thing, as I think about this, as you're explaining it and talking through it, this really is sort of the antidote to that wellness articulation of the gospel, too. At least for
Mm-hmm.
us Western mainliners. I feel that tension all the time to go into that wellness talk, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast. And we want to get voluntary participants to join our church, and a lot of times the trappings and language we use is that wellness talk. This is not that at all.
No.
But there's a huge barrier where I think we need to have vulnerability and be willing to sound like a crazy person as we share these stories. I, as a pastor, have experienced this in many ways. A lot of times it'll come at a deathbed, as someone is passing away and I'm there with their family. That is just the most holy and intimate time. And I've seen some crazy stuff, some really powerful, moving, incredible, words can't explain it, types of events and things. But, I've tried to use those stories in sermons before, and then I could just feel in the back of my head being like, I sound like a crazy person right now. People are going to be worried about me. And I think that's the barrier we have to overcome. But this is such a wonderful, move against that wellness temptation that I think all of us mainliners fall into, that this is it. That's why you underline this, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said this is the problem. But it is, to your point, it really is the issue of the crowd, like in Acts, that these people are drunk. These people are drunk. Like our pastor is drunk. Like that's what we worry about. And it's not so much drunk as it's like our pastor for mainliners. It's like our pastor's an anti-intellectual. Our pastor is, but there is a sense like does part of proclaiming the gospel. I mean, is there an issue for the main line? I'm just to speak of the main line. I know we have listeners beyond the main line here and beyond America for that point. But is there something in American mainline Protestantism that we're scared of being perceived as drunk? Like to the crowd, we're afraid of being perceived as out of our minds, as kind of irrational. And I think there's something for all of our debates of what it means to be in the world, and all that crap that goes on and how poorly we perpetuate those conversations and have those conversations. There is something within the main line that this kind of convictional neuroses says that we are afraid of being perceived by the crowd, the intelligentsia, because we still were at one point we were the intelligentsia. We're not anymore, but we still kind of remember it longingly, like we're one of the in the House of Dragons, we're one of the very small noble families that no one cares about anymore, but we still think of ourselves as nobility, so we're like we don't want to be perceived as as improper. And
in a world of dynamic stabilization, the leader of an organization cannot be perceived to be unstable, and that's how I feel when I talk about this kind of stuff.
Well, exactly. And Loder says this in the quote, and this is probably a good place for us to end. Like Loder says in the quote, the fear is to be out of control. And so to allow people to testify to these experiences and interpret them means you have to be able to handle some level of being out of control. And the Pentecost experience is one of that's out of control. And the crowd perceives them as drunk, as out of their minds, as uncontrollable. And like there is chaos, and the pastor's job is to keep from chaos in the community, but the pastor's job is not to shut the windows and keep the winds of the spirit from blowing, nor to keep the human being in their human spirit from yearning and suffering to find answers to questions, what is a lifetime and why do I live it? And yet this kind of convictional neuroses actually cuts down the horizon. It narrows the purviews of what it means to answer the question, what is a lifetime and why do I live it? And who is this God who's encountered me in the midst of that? I mean, if we don't hold on to those stories in our churches, that the Spirit moves and meets people, that Jesus Christ is alive and encounters people, then there really is very little point, if you ask me. And so I think Loder was really prophetic.